The gate was brand new. Black iron, keypad entry, a brass sign that read, Pinecrest Reserve, Private Community. It was sitting dead center on my grandfather's land. I'm standing there with a 1,987 land survey in one hand and a notarized deed in the other, watching a man in a golf cart wave me off like I'm a door-to-door salesman. Sir, this is a private community. You cannot enter without resident authorization. I looked at the gate. I looked at the deed. I looked back at him. There were 214 homes behind that gate. A clubhouse, a pool, a man-made lake with a dock. All of it, every single square foot, sitting on 400 acres that my grandfather homesteaded in 1951 and never once sold. What this golf cart guard didn't know was that I'd spent the previous 6 weeks in 3 different county courthouses. And what I found there wasn't just a property dispute. It was a 22-year cover-up. Stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything, including the lives of 214 families who thought they owned something they never did. I've spent 15 years reading land for other people. Not reading about it, reading it. The way a survey marker sits in frozen ground tells you something. The way a fence line drifts 3 degrees off the legal description tells you something else. Most people walk across a piece of earth and see grass or dirt or potential. I walk across it and see a document. I see boundaries. I see history recorded in iron pins and concrete monuments that nobody planted by accident. My father taught me that. His father taught him. I never thought I'd have to use those skills to fight for my own family's land, but here we are. My name is Cole Decker. I'm a licensed land surveyor based out of Reno, Nevada. I've worked county contracts, private developments, pipeline corridors, tribal land assessments. I have spent the better part of my adult life making sure other people's property lines are exactly where they're supposed to be. And then my grandfather died, and I found out that mine weren't. Elias Decker passed in March. He was 89 years old, and he died in the same county where he'd homesteaded 400 acres of raw California scrubland back in 1951, before I existed, before my father existed, before anyone thought that particular stretch of high desert was worth anything to anyone. The call came from a county administrator, not a lawyer, not a relative, a county administrator, calling to notify me that I was the sole surviving heir to a parcel of real property in Kern County, California, and that there were some matters requiring attention. I assumed unpaid taxes, maybe a collapsed structure, maybe a fence line dispute with a neighbor. I was not prepared for what I found. The ranch has a name. Elias gave it one back when he filed the original claim. He burned it into a wooden sign and hung it on the gatepost in 1952, and it was still there, faded and splitting, when he died. Decker Flats. That name is 70 years of one family's life in 2 words. Somebody tried to erase it. They almost succeeded. Elias Decker arrived in Kern County, California in the fall of 1949 with $200 in his pocket, a canvas duffel bag, and no particular plan beyond finding work. He was 22 years old. He'd come from nothing, a sharecropper's son from eastern Oklahoma who'd watched his own father work land his whole life without ever owning a single acre of it. That image never left him. The idea that a man could pour his entire life into soil that belonged to someone else and die with nothing to show for it but a calloused pair of hands and a debt he couldn't settle. Elias was determined that wouldn't be him. He spent his first 2 years in California working cattle drives, seasonal ranch labor, sleeping in bunkhouses, saving everything he earned, and spending almost nothing. By 1951, he had enough to act. What most people don't know, what I didn't fully appreciate until I started digging through the records myself, is that legitimate homestead claims in California were still legally available to working men well into the early 1952s. Under provisions that extended from the original Homestead Act, a citizen could claim raw federal land by establishing residence, making improvements, and working the land continuously for a specified period. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast, but it was real. Elias filed his claim on 400 acres of high desert scrubland in the spring of 1951. The land was considered marginal, too rocky for easy farming, too dry for reliable pasture without irrigation work. Nobody else wanted it. That was exactly why he could afford it. He built a one-room structure that first summer, dug a well by hand, 31 feet down before he hit water. He told my father it took him 3 weeks and he lost 8 pounds doing it. He ran his first 40 head of cattle the following spring. By 1960, Elias Decker owned a functioning ranch operation, a proper barn, a bunkhouse for seasonal hands, a creek he'd partially diverted for irrigation. The land had a name. The land had a deed. The land had his name on both. He called it Decker Flats, and he never once considered selling it. My father grew up on Decker Flats. He knew every inch of it, which section of the creek ran cold even in August, which slope the cattle avoided after rain, where the old oak grove started and where it ended at the northeast corner of the property. He passed that knowledge to me in pieces, the way fathers do, during summers I spent at the ranch as a boy. I remember the smell of dry grass in the heat, the particular sound the wind made coming through the canyon break on the western edge, the way Elias moved across his own land, unhurried, completely certain, like a man who had nowhere else to be and no reason to rush. My father died when I was 26. I won't spend long on that. It changed things. I moved away, built my career in Nevada, visited less often, then rarely, then not at all. The last time I set foot on Decker Flats before all of this, I was 34 years old. Elias was still sharp then, still running a reduced cattle operation, still living in the original structure he'd expanded over the decades. But he was getting older, and the land was getting harder to manage alone. Around 2000, he hired a local property management company called Castle Rock Land Services to handle the administrative side of things, property taxes, maintenance contracts, keeping unauthorized people off the acreage. He'd seen the name in a local agricultural newsletter. They came recommended by a county extension officer he trusted. He signed a management agreement and handed over the paperwork. I didn't know about Castle Rock until after he was gone. I drove out from Reno the week after the county administrator called. 8 hours, straight shot down 395, cutting southwest into Kern County just before dark. I stopped at a motel in Tehachapi, slept badly, and drove the last 30 miles the following morning. I knew the route from memory. County Road 14, past the feed store that had been there since before I was born, left at the junction with the old water tower, 2 miles of unpaved track to Elias's front gate. Except the unpaved track was paved now. I slowed down. The road surface was new asphalt, clean and unmarked at the edges. A street sign had been planted at the junction, green aluminum, standard issue, the kind the county puts up. It read, Pinecrest Reserve Boulevard. My GPS had no record of it. I sat there for a moment with the truck in park, looking at that sign. Then I drove forward. The road climbed gently for about a quarter mile before it leveled out, and that's when I saw them. Rooftops, dozens of them, maybe more, terracotta tile and desert modern flat lines clustered together in that unmistakable pattern of a planned residential development. A water tower, new, painted beige, rose above the tree line to the east. I could see the top of what looked like a clubhouse, then the guardhouse. Black iron gate, keypad entry, a brass sign mounted on a stone pillar, Pinecrest Reserve, private community. I pulled up to the gate. A man in a golf cart rolled out to meet me, 50-ish, sunburned, HOA logo on his shirt. He had the expression of someone who had turned people away from this gate before and found the process entirely routine. Sir, this is a private community. Resident authorization required for entry. I looked at him. I looked at the gate. I looked at the 1987 survey map on my passenger seat. I said very calmly, I think I own this. He did not appear moved by this information. They made me wait 40 minutes outside the gate before someone came. The man who came was not a security guard and not a lawyer. He arrived in a black Range Rover, unhurried, parked at an angle like a man who doesn't worry about taking up too much space. He stepped out and extended his hand before I'd even opened my truck door. Douglas Harlan, HOA president, retired developer. He was in his mid-60s, deeply tanned, the kind of tan that comes from genuine outdoor living rather than a salon. He wore a collared shirt, pressed khakis, and a watch I recognized as a submariner without needing to look twice. Everything about him was calibrated. The handshake was firm but not aggressive. The smile arrived exactly on schedule. He led me to the clubhouse, a well-appointed building with vaulted ceilings, desert landscaping out front, and a view from the rear windows that looked out over a man-made lake that I was fairly certain had been built over what used to be Elias's lower pasture. He offered me water. He offered me coffee. He spoke the way people speak when they have been professionally trained to speak, with warmth and control, and the careful avoidance of anything that could be repeated in a courtroom. "I think there may be some confusion around the recorded plat maps," he said, setting his coffee down with the ease of a man discussing a scheduling error. "These things happen with older parcels. Historic boundaries, multiple corrective filings over the years. Our attorneys have reviewed the chain of title on this property extensively." He never denied anything directly. He never raised his voice. He never said I was wrong. He simply made the entire matter sound like a misunderstanding that better-informed people had already resolved. I listened. I asked careful questions. I watched his eyes. Then, toward the end of the meeting, he said something almost casually. "The way you drop a detail when you want it absorbed without examination." "Castle Rock handled the original land agreement," he said. "If you have further questions about the history, you'd really want to speak with them." Castle Rock, the same company Elias hired to protect his land. I drove back to the motel that evening and sat in the parking lot for a long time before I went inside. I want to pause here and make sure you understand the full scale of what I was looking at, because the numbers matter. 400 acres in that part of Kern County, developed, water accessible with established infrastructure, carries a current assessed land value of approximately $4.2 million. That's before you put a single structure on it. Pinecrest Reserve had put 214 structures on it. Average purchase price per home, $380,000. Total community value, somewhere north of $81 million. HOA fees ran $420 per household per month, nearly $90,000 a month flowing into Pinecrest Reserve's operating account. Not $1 of any of it had ever reached a decker. But the financial picture was only part of the problem. My attorney, a real estate lawyer I contacted that same week, a quiet, thorough man named Gerald Foss, who'd practiced county property law for 30 years, laid out the other part. If the chain of title fraud held up, I wouldn't just lose the land. The cloud on title created by my quiet title filing could theoretically expose me to civil liability from 214 homeowners whose own titles were now in question. People who'd bought in good faith, paid their mortgages, lived their lives. People who had nothing to do with what Harlan did. That was the trap Harlan had built, consciously or not. Winning could still cost me everything. I sat in my truck at dusk, parked on the road outside the Pinecrest gate, watching the last light go orange across the terracotta rooflines. 214 homes, a clubhouse, a lake, a man-made world. All of it sitting on land my grandfather named before any of those people were born. Someone had changed the name before they changed the deed. I needed to understand exactly how. I've pulled county records hundreds of times in my career. It's not glamorous work. It smells like old paper and fluorescent lighting and the particular staleness of rooms where documents go to be forgotten. But I know how to read what's in those rooms. I know what I'm looking for and, more importantly, I know what missing information looks like. I started at the Kern County Recorder's office the Monday after my meeting with Harlan. The first thing I pulled was the continuous tax record on the Decker parcel, a straightforward request, the kind of thing any property owner can do. What I expected to find was an unbroken line of annual tax payments in the Decker family name stretching from 1952 to the present. What I found instead was a clean break. The Decker name disappeared from the tax rolls in 2001. Not gradually, cleanly. One year it was there. The next year, a new parcel number appeared in its place, and the ownership field listed a limited liability company called Pinecrest Development Partners, LLC. I pulled the instrument that caused the transition. It was a document called a correction affidavit recorded on March 14, 2001 and signed by an authorized representative of Castle Rock Land Services. Now, most people have never heard of a correction affidavit, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. A correction affidavit is a legitimate legal instrument. It exists for a good reason. Sometimes recorded documents contain genuine clerical errors. A misspelled name, a transposed number in a legal description, a wrong township designation. The correction affidavit allows those minor errors to be fixed without reopening the original deed. It's a housekeeping tool. But because it's treated as routine, correction affidavits often receive minimal scrutiny from county recorders. They move through the system quickly. They don't require the original property owner's signature, only the signature of an authorized agent with a stated connection to the original transaction. In the wrong hands, a correction affidavit isn't housekeeping. It's a scalpel. What this particular affidavit had done, buried in the technical language of legal descriptions and township survey references, was rotate the boundary reference point of the Decker parcel by a fraction of a degree. A change so small it looked like a clerical fix. A change so precisely calculated that it shifted 380 of the 400 acres out of the Decker deed and into a newly created parcel number registered to Pinecrest Development Partners, LLC. I read it 3 times before I was certain I understood what I was seeing. Then I noticed the notary stamp. The affidavit had been notarized by a woman named Patricia Hollins, Notary Public, commission number 1,847,762. I ran the commission number through the state notary database that afternoon. Patricia Hollins's notary license had been revoked in 2004, 3 years after she stamped this document. Revoked, not expired? Revoked for reasons the public record listed only as professional misconduct. I photographed everything. Every page, every stamp, every margin notation. I walked out of the recorder's office into the flat white California afternoon, and I stood in the parking lot for a moment because I needed to feel the sun on my face and remind myself that this was real. The address listed on Castle Rock Land Services business registration was a suite number in a strip mall on the eastern edge of Bakersfield. I drove out there the following morning. The suite was a mail forwarding operation, the kind of place where you rent a box number and it appears on your letterhead as a real address. The woman behind the counter confirmed that Castle Rock had rented a box there from 1998 to 2009 before discontinuing service. She had no forwarding information. She had no contact for the principals. She had nothing. Castle Rock's California business license had been listed as inactive since 2009. The entity had simply been dissolved. No bankruptcy, no formal closing documents, no news coverage. It had existed, performed its function, and quietly ceased to exist. But a dissolved company still has a paper trail if you know where to pull it. I requested the original business registration documents from the California Secretary of State's office. The registered agent for Castle Rock Land Services, the legal entity designated to receive official correspondence on the company's behalf, was a law firm in Bakersfield called Merritt, Hale and Associates. I looked up Merritt, Hale and Associates. The firm had dissolved in 2012. The founding partner, a man named Robert Merritt, had retired and moved to Arizona. But his former junior associate, a man who had been listed on the firm's letterhead as a specialist in real estate transactions and title matters, had not retired. He had moved to a larger firm across town, and he was currently listed on the Kern County Bar Association's directory as the General Counsel for Pinecrest Reserve Homeowners Association. His name was Alan Greer. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The man who had served as registered agent for the company that filed the fraudulent correction affidavit, the company Elias Decker had trusted with his land, had spent the intervening 2 decades installing himself as the legal protector of the community built on top of that fraud. He was not hiding. He was not in another state. He was in a corner office 4 miles from the county recorder's office, billing hours to the HOA that collected fees from the land he'd helped steal. This was not opportunistic fraud. Someone had planned this. Someone had thought it through from the beginning, and that someone had been careful enough and patient enough to still be sitting in place 22 years later. I hired a skip trace researcher through a contact I had from a tribal land case I'd worked in Nevada. Her name isn't important. What she found is Douglas Harlan's professional history laid out cleanly. He had not simply been a real estate developer who stumbled across an opportunity in Kern County. In the late 1992, Douglas Harlan had been the managing partner of Castle Rock Land Services. He was the company. He had created Castle Rock specifically to operate as a property management service, a legitimate-seeming business that gave him access to landowners who needed help managing remote or aging parcels. He advertised in agricultural newsletters and county extension publications. He built a small client list of elderly landowners, absentee heirs, and farm operations that had outgrown their owners' capacity to manage them. Elias Decker was not his only client, but Elias's land was by far the most valuable parcel in Castle Rock's portfolio. Once Harlan had the management agreement, which gave him legal authority to act on behalf of the property for administrative purposes, he had everything he needed. He had access to the original deed documents. He had the legal standing to make recorded filings as an authorized representative. He had Alan Greer to structure the paperwork. He filed the correction affidavit in March of 2001. Elias was 74 years old and had no reason to check the county recorder's database. Why would he? He'd hired someone to handle exactly this kind of administrative detail. By 2003, Harlan had dissolved Castle Rock, formed Pinecrest Development Partners, LLC, and broken ground on the first phase of the community. He sold 214 homes over the following 6 years. He installed himself as HOA president. He retained Alan Greer as HOA counsel, the one man who knew exactly where everybody was buried, which meant he was the one man Harlan needed to keep close. And for 19 years it had worked. My grandfather had lived 20 minutes from his own stolen land for the last decade of his life, paying property taxes on the 20 acres that remained in his name, entirely unaware that 380 acres had been quietly reclassified beneath him. That thought stayed with me for days. It still does. I need to be honest about something I wrestled with throughout this entire process, because I think it matters. The 214 families behind that gate, most of them had nothing to do with what Douglas Harlan did. They were buyers. They found a listing, toured a model home, signed a purchase contract, and moved their furniture in. They paid their mortgages faithfully. They painted their front doors and planted their front yards and raised their children on streets that had names Harlan had invented, in a community built on a foundation that was never legally his to build on. They were, in the most direct sense, victims of the same fraud I was. And yet, some of them knew, or suspected. 3 weeks after my first visit to the courthouse, an envelope appeared under the door of my motel room. Plain white, no return address. Inside was a single index card, handwritten in the careful print of someone who had thought carefully about each word before putting it down. Check the original plat filing date against the development permit approval date. The dates don't match. Someone signed off on a permit before the plat was legally recorded. That person is still working in the county planning department. No signature. Nothing else. Someone inside Pinecrest Reserve, someone who either lived there or had professional knowledge of its development history, was uncomfortable enough with what they knew to take a risk, but not yet comfortable enough to attach their name to it. I was not alone. I made copies of the card and secured the original. I didn't know yet who had sent it, and I wasn't going to speculate. But the information itself was actionable. I pulled the plat filing date from the recorder's office and cross-referenced it with the development permit approval date in the county planning department's public records. The anonymous source was right. The development permit for Pinecrest Reserve Phase 1 had been approved 11 days before the corrected plat was legally recorded. Under California planning law, that sequence is not a technicality. It means the permit was issued against a parcel that had not yet legally completed its title transformation. Someone in the planning department had signed off on an approval they were not yet authorized to give. The fraud had not stayed inside Castle Rock's walls. It had reached into county government. Gerald Foss had been practicing real estate law in Kern County for 30 years. His office looked exactly like you'd expect. Stacked files, a dying plant, a window that faced the parking structure. He was the opposite of a TV lawyer. He was thorough and honest, and he did not tell people what they wanted to hear. He reviewed everything I'd gathered over 2 full meetings, reading each document with the unhurried patience of someone who had learned long ago that the details were where the truth lived. Then he told me where I stood. The fraud was real and, in his opinion, provable. The correction affidavit was defective. The notary revocation alone raised serious questions about the document's legal validity, and the chain of title leading from Castle Rock to Pinecrest Development Partners had irregularities that would not survive scrutiny in front of a competent judge. But real property fraud cases in California civil court are slow. 18 months to trial on an optimistic timeline. 3 to 5 years if Harlan's team contested aggressively at every stage. There was also the question of the statute of limitations. California allows 5 years from the date of discovery to file a quiet title action, a specific type of lawsuit used to establish clear legal ownership when competing claims exist. Unlike a standard civil claim, a quiet title action can resolve all competing interests simultaneously, meaning it could address not just my claim against Harlan, but the title questions for all 214 homeowners at once. The clock for my claim had started, legally speaking, when I inherited. That gave me time. Not unlimited time, but time. What Gerald said next I wrote down exactly. You have a case, but Alan Greer has been building his defense for 22 years. He knows exactly what you're going to find before you find it. He's already positioned for this. You need to find something he didn't think to prepare for. I thanked him, drove back to the motel, and sat down with everything I had. I needed to find what Harlan thought he'd buried. I had been in Kern County for just under 3 weeks when the first signal arrived. A certified letter from Alan Greer's firm addressed to me at the motel. 4 pages, dense legal formatting, asserting that I had been making unauthorized contact with Pinecrest Reserve residents and conducting unlicensed investigative activities on private property, and formally demanding that I cease all such activities or face civil action for harassment and trespass. I had not set foot inside the Pinecrest gate since my first meeting with Harlan. Every document I had obtained was pulled from public county records using my legal right as a member of the public. I had spoken to exactly 2 Pinecrest residents, both of whom had approached me voluntarily in a public parking lot after apparently hearing through the community that Elias Decker's grandson was in town. The letter was not a legal document with teeth. It was a message. We know what you're doing. We are watching. Stop. 2 days after the letter arrived, 3 documents I had specifically noted and photographed at the county recorder's office were listed as unavailable for public access due to ongoing administrative review. The recorder's clerk, when I asked, could not explain what administrative review process applied to already recorded public documents or who had initiated it. Then, on a Tuesday evening, a man knocked on my motel room door. He said he was a county code compliance officer. He showed no badge, offered no identification number, and asked whether I was operating commercial surveying equipment without a county work permit. I was a licensed Nevada surveyor working on my own family's inherited property. No permit was required. I asked for his name and employee ID number. He said he'd follow up with the information. He never did. I never saw him again. I called Gerald Foss that night. They're not rattled, I told him. They're activated. There was a pause on the line. Good, he said quietly. Rattled men make mistakes. Activated men reveal their networks. Keep pulling. I want to tell you what it feels like to walk a property line you've known since childhood and realize with professional certainty that someone moved it. It isn't anger. Not at first. It's something quieter and colder than anger. The specific feeling of watching a lie become visible in 3 dimensions. In real space, on real ground, under your boots. I went out on a Thursday just after sunrise. I had the 1,987 survey map, the last survey commissioned during Elias's active management of the ranch, and I had the original government land survey notes from the 1,951 homestead filing, which I'd requested from the Bureau of Land Management field office in Sacramento. I had my GPS unit, my field notebook, and 15 years of professional experience reading exactly this kind of documentation. I also had my camera running the entire time. I started at the northeast corner, the 20 acres that had never been developed, still legally in the Decker name, still accessible from the county road. The original cabin was there, barely standing but structurally present. Walls intact, roof partially collapsed on the east side, the door swollen in its frame from years of temperature cycling. And there, set in concrete at the corner of the property, was the original government survey marker. A 3-inch iron pipe with a brass cap, stamped with the original survey date and township reference. 63 years in the ground, completely undisturbed, completely unambiguous. I noted its GPS coordinates. I photographed it from 6 angles. Then I began walking the boundary line. What a correction affidavit cannot do, what no paper document can ever do, is move iron from concrete. Government survey markers, once set, are permanent fixtures of the legal landscape. They predate any subsequent recording. They are, in the hierarchy of land evidence, the closest thing to ground truth that exists in American property law. The markers told the story the paper had been altered to hide. Following the original 1,951 survey notes, I walked the full boundary of what should have been the 400-acre Decker parcel. I marked each original monument I found. 4 of the 6 were still in place, undisturbed. The 2 missing ones had been in areas now covered by Pinecrest's internal roadway system, which was itself telling. At the southwest corner, where the correction affidavit's altered legal description placed the new boundary line, there was no monument. There was no physical evidence of any surveyed corner. There was only a landscaping berm and the edge of a cul-de-sac, because the corrected boundary wasn't real. It had been invented on paper. Nobody had ever set iron for it because it didn't correspond to any actual survey. It was a legal description written by someone who understood how to manipulate language in a deed without understanding or caring that the ground itself kept its own record. The original boundary consumed 380 acres of Pinecrest Reserve. Every structure, every road, every utility line, every square foot of that man-made lake, sitting inside the original Decker boundary, as clearly as if Elias himself had drawn the line. I filed my professional survey report with the county recorder's office that same afternoon under my Nevada license with a formal cover letter citing the specific monuments found and their GPS coordinates. It was now a matter of public record. Harlan had spent 22 years building on paper. I'd just put the ground on record. I need to take a moment here because something happened at the northeast corner that I didn't expect. After I finished documenting the survey markers, I walked back to the old cabin. I'd noted it professionally, existing structure, partial roof failure, salvageable walls, and then I'd moved on. But on my way back to the truck, I stopped. I don't know why I stopped. Professional habit, maybe, or something less rational than that. I pushed the door open. It took effort. The wood had swollen and warped until the frame was barely recognizable as a rectangle. Inside, the light came through the collapsed roof section in long, late-afternoon columns. The floor was dirt over original plank, and it had been undisturbed long enough that small desert plants had pushed up through the gaps near the wall. Against the far wall, beneath a wooden shelf that had partially pulled away from its mounting, there was a metal document box. The kind sold at hardware stores for home filing, grey, fireproof, latched but not locked. I brought it outside into the light and opened it. Inside, Elias's original homestead filing paperwork. Hand-copied deed language in his own handwriting. He'd copied it himself. I recognized the careful, unpracticed printing of a man who wrote rarely but deliberately. Tax receipts going back to 1954. A photograph of the original cabin taken sometime in the early 1960s. A young woman standing in the doorway. My grandmother, before I existed, before any of this existed. And a short letter, written on a torn piece of notebook paper, dated 1974, not addressed to anyone. Just a note Elias had written to no one in particular, or maybe to himself, or maybe to whoever came after. If you're reading this, the land outlasted us both. Good. I stood there in the afternoon light with that piece of paper in my hands for a long time. The person who had slid the index card under my motel room door reached out again 10 days after I filed the survey. This time it was a phone call, blocked number, brief, the caller speaking in the careful, measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say before dialing. Her name was Margaret Chu. She was 71 years old, and she had been one of the original Pinecrest homebuyers in 2003. She had purchased in Phase 1, one of the first 40 families to move in, back when the community was still mostly framing and construction dust. She had been a title insurance underwriter for 26 years before her retirement. She knew what clean title looked like. She knew what it felt like when something wasn't right. When she'd purchased her home at Pinecrest, she had asked Alan Greer's office specific questions about the chain of title. She had reviewed the title commitment more carefully than the average buyer. She had found language that troubled her, a reference to the corrected homestead recording buried in a subordinate clause on page 11 of a 14-page legal opinion letter. Greer's office had reassured her. The correction was routine, they said. A minor clerical adjustment in the original homestead filing. Nothing that affected the validity of the title chain. She had accepted that answer. She had moved in, planted a garden, made the house hers over 19 years. She had told herself that she'd simply been overcautious, that professionals had reviewed it, that it was fine. She had never fully believed that. When word spread through the community that a Decker heir had shown up with a deed and a survey map, Margaret had spent 3 days deciding what to do. Then she'd written the index card and driven to my motel at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. What she had kept, filed in a manila folder in her home office for 19 years, was the complete purchase document package from her 2003 closing, including the original legal opinion letter from Greer's firm. Page 11, paragraph 4. Buried so completely that most buyers would never reach it. Title derived from corrected homestead recording dated March 14, 2001. Independent verification of original homestead boundary recommended for purchasers with specific concerns regarding survey history. Greer had not hidden the fraud entirely. He had disclosed it, technically, minimally, in language engineered to be overlooked. It was the kind of disclosure that protected a lawyer from bar sanctions while ensuring that no buyer would ever actually act on it. It was also, Margaret noted with the quiet precision of a 26-year industry veteran, an admission. I made certified copies of every page that night and locked the originals in my truck. Alan Greer had left a paper trail. He had just assumed no one would ever connect it to the ground. Gerald Foss filed the quiet title action on a Monday morning in late October. The filing named Douglas Harlan personally. It named the Pinecrest Reserve Homeowners Association. It named Pinecrest Development Partners, LLC, the original development entity, which technically still existed as a dormant California corporation. And it named Merritt, Hale, and Associates as a respondent in connection with the fraudulent notarization, specifically the firm's liability for the professional conduct of its registered agent relationship with Castle Rock. Alan Greer was not named as a defendant. Gerald had been deliberate about that. An attorney named as a defendant becomes an adversary. An attorney who understands he could be named, who watches his former firm named in a filing that connects directly to work he performed, becomes something more useful. He becomes nervous. The filing hit the county recorder's public database at 9:14 on a Monday morning. By noon, a land rights blogger who monitored Kern County property filings for contentious cases had written a short post about it. The headline was plain and accurate. Quiet title action filed against gated community developer. Claimant alleges 22-year homestead fraud. By Wednesday evening, a regional television news affiliate had called Gerald's office requesting comment. Gerald said nothing on the record. He didn't need to. The filing spoke clearly enough on its own. Inside Pinecrest Reserve, the reaction was not uniform, and it was not calm. 3 homeowners, independently, without coordination, retained their own attorneys within the first week of the filing becoming public knowledge. All 3 had professional backgrounds that made them capable of reading what the filing actually said. A retired bank compliance officer, a semi-retired CPA, and a woman who had spent 20 years as a paralegal for a commercial real estate firm. All 3 immediately requested their original title insurance policies and sent formal inquiry letters to their respective title insurance companies. This was the move Harlan had not fully prepared for. Not the lawsuit itself. He had always known a lawsuit was a possible scenario. He had prepared legal defenses. He had Alan Greer. What he had not prepared for was the title insurance industry. Title insurance companies are not passive participants in a quiet title dispute. When a claim is filed that potentially implicates the validity of policies they've written, they activate their own investigative resources. And under California insurance law, title companies have subrogation rights, meaning if they are ultimately required to pay out on fraudulent title claims, they have the legal right to pursue the party who caused the fraud for full reimbursement. Harlan was not facing one plaintiff. He was potentially facing 214 title insurance claims simultaneously, each one carrying subrogation rights that pointed directly at him. Within 3 weeks of the filing, 2 separate title insurance companies had retained independent counsel and begun their own document review processes. They were not parties to my case. They were conducting parallel investigations driven entirely by their own financial exposure. The machine Harlan had built, clean, quiet, invisible for 22 years, was now visible from 3 directions at once. Alan Greer filed a motion to withdraw as HOA counsel on a Friday afternoon. The motion cited a conflict of interest without elaborating on the nature of that conflict. In the legal world, a defense attorney withdrawing on conflict grounds while his client is actively under civil assault is not a subtle signal. Every attorney in Kern County who read that filing understood what it meant. Greer was positioning himself as a witness, not a defender. The following week, the Kern County District Attorney's Office contacted Gerald Foss to inform him that a preliminary inquiry had been opened into the 2001 notarization by Patricia Hollins. Specifically, whether the notarization had been obtained through fraud or coercion given her subsequent license revocation. Harlan called an emergency HOA meeting on a Tuesday night. I was not invited. A resident whose name I will not share recorded it on their phone and sent me the audio file the following morning. Harlan's voice on the recording was steady. Practiced? He had clearly prepared. This is a nuisance claim by a disgruntled heir who inherited a parcel with a complicated title history. Our chain of title has been reviewed by competent legal counsel and is sound. We will defend this community vigorously. Half the room, from what I could hear, responded with the silence of people who wanted to believe him. The other half responded with the silence of people who had already called their own attorneys. I drove into Pinecrest Reserve on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the HOA meeting. Not through the main gate. The guardhouse had standing instructions to deny me entry. But the development had a secondary maintenance access road on the eastern boundary, a paved service lane that connected to the county road grid and had no gate, no guard, and no signage marking it as restricted. I knew it was there because it appeared on the county planning department's infrastructure maps as a public utility access corridor. I had every legal right to use it. Harlan's house was the largest in the community, a single-story desert modern structure on an oversized lot at the western end of the development. I had identified it from the county assessor's records. The lot it sat on corresponded, in the original survey, to the area directly above Elias's original well site, the well my grandfather had dug by hand in the summer of 1951. 31 feet down, 8 pounds of body weight, 3 weeks of work. I parked on the street in front of his house and knocked on the door. He answered himself. No assistant, no security. Just Douglas Harlan in a collared shirt, holding a coffee cup, looking at me the way a man looks at something he expected but hoped wouldn't arrive. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You should leave." I looked at him. I looked at the house behind him, the clean lines, the expensive landscaping, the view from his front window that looked out over a community he had built on land that was never his. "My grandfather dug the well your house is sitting on," I said. 31 feet by hand, the summer of 1951. I just wanted you to know I found it. I turned and walked back to my truck. Behind me, I heard his front door close. When I glanced in my rearview mirror as I pulled away, I could see him still standing in the doorway. His hands were shaking. The civil case took 14 months. I want to be honest about what that means, because television and YouTube thumbnails have trained people to expect justice to arrive fast and clean and final. It doesn't. 14 months is the sound of depositions scheduled and rescheduled. It's the smell of a motel room you've been living in too long. It's phone calls with Gerald that start with updates and end with patience. It's watching a process move at its own pace regardless of how certain you are of the outcome. But it moved. The court granted quiet title to the Decker estate on 380 acres on a Thursday morning in December. I was sitting in Gerald's office when the clerk called. I don't remember exactly what I said. I remember Gerald setting down his pen very carefully and exhaling through his nose, slowly, like a man releasing something he'd been holding for a long time. The court's findings were unambiguous. The 2001 correction affidavit was determined to be fraudulent. The judgment specifically cited the defective notarization, the absence of any legitimate clerical error warranting correction, and the documented connection between Castle Rock Land Services and Pinecrest Development Partners through Douglas Harlan as managing principal. Harlan was ordered to pay $1.4 million in damages to the Decker estate, calculated as the fair market rental value of the 380 acres over 22 years, adjusted for the land's appreciated value over that period. The 214 homeowners were not displaced. I want to say that clearly because I know it's the question most people carry through this entire story. The court issued a structured settlement framework under which individual homeowners' titles to their specific lots were quieted and secured through a newly established ground lease agreement with the Decker estate. They would continue to own their homes. They would pay a ground lease fee, set at fair market rate, significantly lower than their existing HOA fees, directly to a land trust established in Elias's name. They had been Harlan's victims. I was not going to make them mine. Harlan himself faced separate criminal fraud charges from the district attorney's office, connected to the notary filing and the planning department permit irregularity the anonymous tip had led me to. He was 67 years old. His attorney negotiated a no-contest plea. Probation. A fine. No prison. I was disappointed. I won't pretend otherwise. But I thought about what Elias would have wanted. He never filed a lawsuit in his life. He never asked for anyone to go to prison. He asked for his land. His name was back on it. Alan Greer did not escape undamaged. The State Bar of California opened a formal investigation into his conduct in connection with the Castle Rock registered agent relationship and the legal opinion letter he had issued to Pinecrest buyers. The letter that disclosed the corrected homestead recording in language specifically engineered to be overlooked. The investigation took 8 months. At the end of it, Greer surrendered his license voluntarily rather than face a formal disciplinary hearing. He issued a statement through his attorney citing a desire to retire from practice. He did not acknowledge wrongdoing. The partner at Merritt, Hale and Associates, who had overseen the original Castle Rock registered agent arrangement, already retired in Arizona, was notified by the bar that his inactive license had been formally suspended. It was largely symbolic. It mattered anyway. The bar investigation itself became a news story in the regional legal press. Other property owners in Kern County began, quietly and then not so quietly, checking their own records. The county recorder's office reported an unusual spike in public records requests for correction affidavits filed between 1998 and 2010. Gerald told me he'd received calls from 4 other attorneys in the county asking about my case methodology. Whatever Castle Rock had done to other landowners, and I have my suspicions, the door was now open. Some truths, once visible, refused to go back underground. The week after the judgment, I drove back out to the northeast corner. Not for professional reasons, not to document anything or file anything or photograph anything. I just needed to go back to the place where this had started and stand in it without an agenda. The oak grove was exactly as I remembered it from childhood. Maybe 30 trees, old-growth desert oaks with trunks thick enough that you couldn't wrap your arms around the largest ones. My grandfather had always said the grove was there before he arrived, that those trees had been standing since before California was a state. I believed him. They had the look of things that belonged to a different scale of time than the rest of us. I went back inside the cabin. The metal box was gone. I had it secured. But the shelf was still there, half pulled from the wall. The dirt floor with the small plants pushing through the planks. The collapsed roof section letting in a column of December light that fell across the exact center of the room. I stood there for a long time. I thought about Elias arriving here in 1951 with $200 and a canvas duffel bag and a determination to own something that would outlast him. I thought about my father, who had known every inch of this land and passed that knowledge to me in pieces. During summers I had been young enough to absorb it without knowing I was absorbing it. I thought about the 11 years I had stayed away. I didn't cry during the legal process. Not once. I cried in that cabin, alone in December light. I think that was the right place for it. I am not a rancher. I want to be clear about that. I am a land surveyor from Reno, Nevada, and that is what I will remain. But I am also the last Decker. And that means something. The ground lease structure with the 214 homeowners generates steady income for the land trust, enough to maintain the property, fund basic, show side panel, conservation work, and keep the taxes current for the foreseeable future. The trust is named the Elias Decker Land Trust. It is a matter of public record. It will outlast me. The 20 acres around the original cabin and the oak grove have been placed under a permanent conservation easement, a legal instrument that prevents subdivision or development of those acres in perpetuity, regardless of who owns the surrounding land or what it becomes. The grove will remain. The cabin will be stabilized and preserved. The well, still structurally intact 31 feet down, will be capped and marked. I had a survey monument installed at the original northeast corner of the property. The permanent kind, iron pipe, concrete base, brass cap, the kind that doesn't move. The kind that Elias would have recognized. The cap is stamped with the township reference, the survey date, and 2 words beneath the standard notation. Decker Flats. The name Elias burned into a wooden sign in 1952 and hung on a gatepost that stood for 70 years. It is now set in brass, in concrete, in ground that belongs to no one else. It will be there long after I am gone. My grandfather never once questioned whether the land was his. He worked it, paid taxes on it, named it, and trusted the wrong person with it near the end of his life. That trust almost cost his family everything he built. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't come back. If I hadn't known how to read a survey. If I hadn't cared enough to walk every inch of it myself, to pull every document, to sit in a courthouse parking lot with a camera and a 15-year-old professional habit that told me the ground always tells the truth even when the paper lies. The land almost disappeared into someone else's story. It almost became the background of 214 people's lives who never knew it had a name before theirs. It didn't. But only barely. If you have ever fought for something that belonged to your family, or if you suspect something isn't right about your own property, your own deed, your own title history, I want to hear it. Drop your story in the comments below. And if this helped even one person know what to ask or where to look, or that the ground keeps its own record even when someone alters the paper, that's enough.